So it was really the funniest thing that I've seen this week. It was even funnier than the thing that Trump said with the Kurds that I mentioned in the last podcast, the arming of the Kurds. So you have these slow dribble of leaks coming out, obviously from Israel, talking about how Israel helped the United Arab Emirates and collaborated with them during the war, provided them with Iron Dome technology to protect against Iranian missile and drone attacks. It was obvious where the leaks were coming from. And then all of a sudden you had this tweet from Benjamin Netanyahu's official account, basically saying that he had traveled to the United Arab Emirates on a secret mission during the war, in the middle of the war, to meet with the ruler of the United Arab Emirates, Mohammed bin Zayed, the leader of Abu Dhabi and the de facto leader of the United Arab Emirates. And they had met together, and okay, wow, that is pretty shocking, because up until now, MBZ, as he's called, Mohammed bin Zayed, has refused to meet with Netanyahu. He'll meet with other Israeli officials, not with Netanyahu, though, because he's so toxic. Instead of confirming it or whatnot, basically the United Arab Emirates came out and said, "Oh, we deny these reports that Netanyahu visited Abu Dhabi during the war." What do you mean reports? Like, as if there are some rumors. It's like, Yani Habibi, the guy himself on his official Twitter account is saying this. Are you saying that Netanyahu is lying? And all these other people started coming out with these comments, and I thought it was just hilarious. They started rejecting this notion. There was a political scientist close to the Emirati leadership who was like, MBZ, it's a scandal even suggests that MBZ would meet with a war criminal such as Netanyahu, and bring him onto the soil of the United Arab Emirates. Anyway, it was a big to-do, and later on I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think is going on here. I'm Borzu Deragahi. I am a longtime foreign correspondent, Middle East correspondent. This is my podcast. It's part of my newsletter and like my little tiny media outlet that I'm trying to start up. It's called Badlands. You can find it at borzu.substack.com. Please subscribe if you're listening in for the first time. Please share. If you're a subscriber already, you can upgrade to become a paid member, perhaps. But anyway, that wasn't the big news this week. Of course, the biggest news today is Donald Trump visiting China and his big meeting that he's been planning for a while. It was supposed to take place last month, but because of the U.S. and Israeli attack on Iran and the ongoing war, that trip got delayed. And so it's happening as we speak. Trump is in China. There was a lot of fanfare, a lot of to-do. And it's extraordinary to me just what a position of weakness the U.S. is in. First of all, it's Trump coming with all these executives trying to impress Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader, trying to impress him as if, how important he regards him. And it's Trump making all sorts of requests publicly. They want China to stop supporting Iran. They want this and that. They want possibly trade deals. They want China to help out on diffusing the crisis in the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz. Anyone who knows anything about the Chinese knows that they are the masters of speaking softly and opaquely, and not basically committing to anything, and pursuing their interests. There were also all sorts of reports that came out in the last few days that China has been secretly supporting Iran, negotiating with them to send weapons. And there's all sorts of other kinds of reports that have come out in recent weeks suggesting that China actually gave a spy satellite to Iran, rather sold the spy satellite to Iran. Iran and China have their relationship. Although they're not like ideologically aligned, China is a lot more of a mercantile actor in the world, and Iran is more of an ideological military actor. They're not totally in sync, but they have a long-standing relationship and goes back to the birth of the Islamic Republic. And it started with Stinger missiles, and it expanded to include all sorts of diplomatic and military ties. As I've mentioned many times, China is a big consumer of Iranian oil, often sold at a discount. So I think that is going to be interesting to watch. A lot of other media are going to be covering that as well. As to this thing in the Gulf, which I found just especially delicious, this whole thing with the UAE and Israel basically saying, Netanyahu basically coming out and saying, it's like, I can't deny it anymore. I've been, going and visiting. I went and visited MBZ, and the UAE denying it. It reminded me of like these 1960s kind of bedroom comedies where you have like the girlfriend and or boyfriend or whatever, like the jilted lover, and basically getting his revenge on, or her getting their revenge against the married person who's sleeping around, and basically the married person, in this case the United Emirates, is like, no, honey, to the rest of the Arab world. It wasn't me. I swear to God, I wasn't messing around. I wasn't two-timing you with Israel. I'm still true to the Arab cause. But, everyone knows, and even some plane tracking sites were monitoring this weird and mysterious flight that left from Israel, these two private jet planes associated with the Israeli premiership, arriving in the Al Ain, one of the seven emirates of the United Arab Emirates, one of the seven little princedoms. And so, there's even evidence of when it happened and flight tracking information about it. So I think that it definitely happened. It's just hilarious and delicious that the United Arab Emirates is in this position of denying it. I think that basically Israel is doing this to further alienate the United Arab Emirates from the rest of the Arab world, to make it so that it has no other relationships in the world, or in the region at least, in the Middle East, other than Israel. This will turn off Saudi Arabia. What is going on here? Saudi Arabia is going to be saying, you're having these secret relations with Israel. I thought we were friends, and so on. And this is going to really, really alienate Saudi Arabia and other Arab countries around the region, having Netanyahu in particular. Like if it was some other Israeli leader, or like if it was Bennett even, or any of the other more relatively moderate figures and less toxic figures, but like having the butcher of Gaza on Arab land at this time, it was just considered kind of scandalous. And I think that that's basically the strategy, is to basically alienate the United Arab Emirates from the rest of the Arab world, make it so that it has no other friends in the region except for Israel. And that is kind of smart on the part of Israel. The danger is that the United Arab Emirates could basically at some point, and I doubt this will happen, but I think it's a remote possibility, they'll say, look, we don't want it. We don't want to be separated from the rest of the Arab world. We don't want this relationship. And it destroys or withdraws from the Abraham Accords altogether. I don't think that will happen, but there is a danger, there is a risk that will happen, just to prove its bona fides to the rest of the Arab world, and especially to its Gulf partners, including Saudi Arabia, Qatar, to a lesser extent, but Kuwait and so on. None of those countries would ever host Netanyahu. They might play footsie with the Israel, but to have the butcher of Gaza step on their soil, it would be not possible. Anyway, this week I had a very interesting conversation with Piotr Kurtzen. He is a podcaster. He has a podcast on global affairs. We had a very productive and interesting interview that I'm going to play for you right now. So I hope you appreciate it and listen in. It's a little bit long, but fast forward through the parts you don't like. But I think it was a very substantive discussion. We talked all sorts about the Iran war, as well as a little bit about Ukraine, and we kind of clashed a little bit and learned a little bit from each other's points of view about the connection between Ukraine and the Gulf states. We also talked about those Gulf states and their role in the war, and their role in the Middle East, and their possible role in the Russia and Ukraine war. So have a listen. Let me just explain the regime a little bit. These guys are really dedicated, and they really do their homework. Let's take the Supreme Leader's office, and that's just one office, and there's parallel institutions to that. The Supreme Leader's office, it's called Beit Rahbari in Persian. It has a complex of think tanks surrounding it. It has its own intelligence service. I will tell you, one time I was in Iraq, during the war against ISIS, and I was with a group of Shia militia, and I met a guy who was from Najaf, and he told me, like, kind of confidentially, he took me aside and he said, and then he starts speaking to me in perfect but Arabic accented Arabic.
This is The Global Gambit.
You're watching The Global Gambit. My name is Piotr. Welcome back to another episode, everyone. We are in the third month of the war in Iran, and there's a lot of developments happening around threats and verbal, well, diarrhea in some cases perhaps, but not much on the action side, not much actual progress towards diplomacy. But one angle that I think is interesting, worth exploring, and we will be doing later on in this video, so keep around to watch that, is the Ukrainian Gulf relationship and the importance that the Gulf have been towards gaining expertise from the Ukrainians, but also vice versa. It's all very complicated, and someone who I thought would know a little bit more about it and help us make sense of it is Borzu Daragi. I think I said that right, didn't I? It's a tricky name to get right.
Oh, don't worry about it. No, Borzu Daragahi.
Daragahi. Oh, there you go, everyone. Daragahi. I practiced it at least 3 times before we came on air, but I still screwed it.
I grew up with this name in the Midwest of the United States in the 1970s and 80s. So I have a pretty thick skin about people mispronouncing my name. No worries.
Well, I have to be Piotr Sergeyevich in England, which is a tricky one given the conflict in Ukraine and Russia. You've previously been correspondent at LA Times, and you've been part of the Atlantic Council at one time as well. But what's your assessment of the latest developments right now? The Iranians have largely just said that we will hit back at you guys if you target us. Trump's threatened, and from what I saw, I think in the Wall Street Journal earlier in the day, he's really contemplating perhaps just returning to kinetic action. How likely do you think that is?
I think it's likely, and I think it's probably at this point a little bit more likely than not likely. I mean, it's really risky for the world economy. It's really risky for the Gulf states. But, probably in Trump's mind and also in the calculations of his most ardent supporters, the kind of Israel lobby in the United States and Benjamin Netanyahu, it's not that big of a risk. So it's like basically a gamble that increasing the kinetic escalating the kinetic response to Iran, just resuming the warfare phase of the war. It's probably to them less costly in their calculations than letting Iran off for now and resuming the kind of maximum pressure blockade situation that Iran has been somewhat under for 47 years and really knows how to get around.
Yeah, we had Alan Neary of the Middle East Institute on yesterday, and I was asking him at the time, sort of, why is it that people fundamentally misunderstand the tenacity of the IRGC in Islamic Republic, at least in negotiation context, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because there just seems to be a massive hubris or arrogance amongst Western policymakers, I think, or onlookers, that sort of Iran is this backward state or run by a bunch of militia. They're not that. They're very well averse in diplomacy and negotiation skills, right?
Yeah, let me just explain the regime a little bit. I mean, these guys are really dedicated and they really do their homework. Let's take the Supreme Leader's office, and that's just one office, and there's parallel institutions to that. The Supreme Leader's office, it's called Beit Rahbari in Persian. It has a complex of think tanks surrounding it. It has its own intelligence service. I will tell you, one time I was in Iraq during the war against ISIS, and I was with a group of Shia militia, and I met a guy who was from Najaf, and he told me, like, kind of confidentially, he took me aside and he said, who the hell are you? And then he starts speaking to me in perfect but Arabic accented Arabic, and he was the guy way out there in like not Anbar in Salahuddin province or Mosul, or somewhere near there. I don't quite remember where he was, like the Beit Rahbari's intelligence representative to this Shia militia out there. And so they have a lot of tentacles. They have the Beit Rahbari, that particular office, has affiliate offices at universities. It has tentacles that go to the religious minorities. It has a representative to the Jewish community, a representative to the, basically minders, to all of this stuff. And that's just one institution. The IRGC has its own think tanks. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs has its own think tanks. The Ministry of Intelligence has its own think tanks. The Supreme National Security Council has its own complex of advisors and academics and scholars. And all of that feed into the decision-making process and the building of infrastructure. All of this has grown over the last 47 years into like a real monster. The state in Iran is a monster. It is a bureaucratic nightmare. Anyone who's ever lived in Iran or dealt with it knows what it's like. And so I think that is one of the main misunderstandings. It's not like some rinky-dink regime run by a supreme like guide or leader or someone like Kim Jong-il or Muammar Gaddafi. It is a system, and the purpose of that system is the survival of the system.
Yeah, certainly it's been underestimated by the West. Trump overestimated himself, underestimated them, I think. One of the things I was talking to Malcolm Nance yesterday about as well is the complexity of the military structure as well. Because a lot of people just think of the IRGC and like, oh, okay, that's the main thing. But that's the ideological branch, the ones that are absolutely committed to the overall cause and vision of the government. So then you've also got the besieged militia, and you've also got the Artesh, which is the conventional military forces. And all in all, what is like 500,000, 1 million troops, personnel upwards? Like, take me through those dynamics there and how it all feeds into the broader system.
Well, the Basij are basically a citizen militia that is very much under the control of the Revolutionary Guard. And that's, I mean, in some ways, when the Revolutionary Guard took full control of the Basij, that was a little bit of progress in the Iranian context, because before they were just like wild bands of roaming youth who would do whatever the hell they wanted in the name of like religion or the Islamic Republic and so on. But what it created was a sort of feeder system. These are the ideological recruits. It starts with the Basij. And the reason why the Revolutionary Guard was formed in the first place, in those first months after the revolution, was as a counterbalance against the army, the Artesh. And there's this myth, I think, in some exile circles. You got to be really careful when you talk to some of them, because they still believe that the Artesh is this independent, autonomous unit that could someday perhaps rise up against the Revolutionary Guard and the Basij and so on. But like, it's my very clear understanding that that ship sailed a few decades ago, and that the Artesh, the army, has been thoroughly infiltrated by the Revolutionary Guard. There's basically, I mean, as fanatic as the IRGC might seem to some people, as dedicated and ideological, unfortunately for any kind of future evolution of Iran, the army is just as infected with that virus of revolutionary fervor and commitment to the regime.
Interesting, because I think a lot of people were wondering whether the Artesh would sort of switch sides, so to speak, during the riots and protests early in January. Nothing happened. And people were also wondering what was their positioning in the broader strikes with the US and Israel in March. But clearly, it's not as different anymore as people might like to claim it is, according to you. But, when we look out at the broader situation, then, the Iranians have been relatively contained or composed in how they've responded to the Americans, and it strikes me that they're presenting much more of a united front than the Trump administration, as Trump seems to undermine his own people around him, right? Would you say that's the case?
Well, yeah, I mean, like I said, that structure that I described, this kind of methodical decision-making process where decisions are ultimately fed to this, the decisions are ultimately made, the information is fed to the Supreme National Security Council, and this deliberative body that includes the supreme leader, the head of the intelligence, head of the IRGC, the president, speaker of parliament, the secretary, that used to be Ali Larijani, the various top regime figures and leaders of the security branches. They meet together and then they decide what the move is going to be. So it's not like Donald Trump getting there on a press conference and saying, we armed the Kurds, we gave them weapons, they did nothing, they take. You would never have a mistake like that, giving, Iran the upper hand, like, oh, you're arming militias and you're arming militias in Iran and you expect us to disarm our militias? Hey, maybe we're going to arm Antifa. So I think that the mistakes that the Trump administration makes because of the undisciplined nature of the decision making and the communications are really undermining any kind of credibility the administration has, as well as its bargaining position. Because think, for example, let's just take that example. Viewers may not know, but just like yesterday, I think it was at a press briefing with like a bunch of kids. They were like students. I don't know what he was thinking. Donald Trump starts ranting about how they gave weapons to the Kurds. Okay, maybe you did, but you admit that, and you basically undermine the position of the U.S. government when it's saying, okay, we want you to stop arming Hamas and the Houthis and Hezbollah. And the Iranians are going to be like, why should we? You're arming your militias, we're arming ours.
Yeah, it's interesting that, and it makes me think of the broader point that's been floated and debated over since this whole situation developed, which is, what is the framing of Mujtaba now? Because from my understanding, other people that we've had on the program, they emphasize that he's a lot more pragmatic. He'd built up a stronger relationship with the IRGC, and that his father, Ali Khamenei, was a lot more ideologically inclined, and therefore he was counterbalancing against the IRGC, which was gaining in influence. But with Mujtaba now in power, that's not the case. Is that true? And the second point to that is, do you think that Iran will become more of like a police state?
I think that's a few different questions. And I will just say that I'm not sure about where Mujtaba is at. I don't think it's necessarily that he's going to be more hardline than his dad. I think that Iran has been experiencing cultural changes that are affecting every walk of life. There has been massive shifts in the role of women, for example, in the celebration of minorities, not just as tokens, but as part of the society and the richness of Iran, in the shift of ideology from religious and this idea of like Islam and the Shia Islam toward a more nationalistic approach, where these nationalistic tropes and images such as like Persepolis and the old kings and the myths of the Book of Kings, the Shahnameh, these are being resurrected and even rejuvenated and incorporated into the propaganda and the messaging of the regime. And that's just this sort of broad cultural change that has taken place. Whether Mujtaba is a hardliner or a softliner and so on, he can't do anything about that. Whether he is pro-hijab or anti-hijab, he can't stop the wave of Iranian women not wearing their hijab, because these guys' own daughters are no longer wearing their hijab. So I think that there's, dramatic changes taking place in the country that he is not immune to. But whether or not that is going to lead to something more moderate, I don't know. I think they're basically the people who are in charge. I think Khamenei, the big guy, the old guy, he was so careful and cautious. We used to play a game, me and my colleagues, when we were listening to Khamenei's speeches, and we would predict what he was going to say in every speech because he was so predictable. And everything he said, every Reuters report about one of his speeches, you could find the same quote from the same guy in the same context 10 years earlier, 15 years earlier. He was the most kind of predictable and stiff and conservative person, and it was his idea of neither nuclear weapons nor no nuclear program. This idea was this idea of not having a nuclear weapon and not dismantling the nuclear program. And I think that now you have a much more unpredictable, much more rejuvenated and young and risk-prone leadership in the country. In many ways, the government is all about surveillance and control. This is one of the, I think, reasons why, for example, this whole issue of the internet, the internet being blocked for so many months. The main reason is, and I've heard it kind of said from people close to the regime, is like, look, you think the Americans aren't monitoring internet? They have the tools to do that, though. They have AI-powered whatever, using Palantir to monitor everyone's internet, using like massive data sets and big, huge data centers to monitor subversive activity on the internet. We don't have those tools, so we have to block internet right now. And I think that that's basically the evidence that it's already somewhat of a extreme police state, because they can't monitor internet the way they would like to. They are shutting off internet for most people. Whereas, for example, if you go and there's ways you can get access to internet right now, but it's in small enough numbers that the regime can monitor it and make sure that you're not communicating with a foreign operative or trying to smuggle weapons into the country and so on. So I think that it's all about control. The Islamic Republic has always been about surveillance and control, and it continues to be so. Whether it will become more like a North Korea isolated from the world, I don't think so. I think it will, because of the nature of the country, because of its porous borders and many borders, because of the cracks between the different ethnic groups and the multiple languages and so on, it will never be as controllable as Libya under Gaddafi or North Korea. Well, I think that it is possible that they do focus on internal development and internal economics and so on. That is the big crisis in the country right now. As a matter of fact, funny story, I was on the Iran-Turkey border and I was talking to this family that had just crossed from Isfahan, and they were like, they really hated the regime, and they were really pro Pahlavi, they were pro Shah, pro monarchy, and they were like really insulting the regime, but they were kind of resigned to the fact that the regime had survived the worst part of the war and it would probably be in power for a while. And one of the guys piped up and he's like, you know what? At least let Mujtaba Khamenei be like MBS. Let him focus on us for a change. Let him focus on, so he didn't mind it was what he was basically saying is like, okay, if it's going to be a dictatorship, at least make it one where they're investing in the country and making the country like developed and so on. I thought that was an interesting and poignant remark. I think right now, the Islamic Republic is facing what it sees as the most threatening moment of its life, of its 47 years. It sees this as a major crisis, and all attention right now, for now, is focused on fending off threats to the regime, as well as, and this is part of the mistakes of the U.S. messaging and war strategy, as well as defending the territorial integrity of the country. It was really dumb of Trump and Netanyahu to make all this messaging about Kurds and ethnic groups and so on and so forth, because what it did was this is like an issue that, like, I mean, I'm Iranian American. I have a pen and a paper in my biography. I'm a journalist in many respects, so I don't feel this tug of nationalism. But even like Iranians I know in the diaspora, when you talk about like, taking this part and separatists here and dividing up the country and so on, you really get their spines to stiffen, and you see them, you see the Iranian nationalism come out. And so I think right now you have a sort of, not completely, a kind of rallying around the flag effect, not for the sake of the regime, but just for the sake of defending the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Iran.
Trump's entire war has, well, firstly, not only brought together people from all walks of life, forming MAGA groups, traditional conservatives, centrists, left-leaning, far-left, all in criticizing this war of choice. But secondly, it's been counterproductive because Iran has suffered so much, and the regime hasn't really been decapitated, despite this being a decapitation strategy, that it's made a lot of Iranians think, well, we kind of wish we hadn't asked for this intervention in the first place. Or you see it differently?
No, I see that a lot, and I've talked to people who have their opinions have evolved. Like, I mean, there was people who wouldn't speak to me at the beginning because I'm like, look, man, we all want to see the end of the Islamic Republic to some extent, or at least an evolution. We all want this regime to change dramatically, if not go away. And I would say even like many people who are members of the Islamic Republic regime, people who are in the leadership, maybe not in the top leadership, but in the middle ranks of the regime, they realize that the government and the system is a dead end, that it has to change fundamentally. So I think there's a lot of people who want that change. But I was saying that this is not going to do it, and this might end up in something much worse. And for that, I lost quite a number of friends. People unfollowed me. People stopped talking to me. But after some weeks, those people sort of sheepishly apologized, many of them, and said, look, I got carried away with this whole thing, but man, did they make a mess of it. And I think that, it started on day one with that school. They lost the war on that day. I didn't say Iran won the war. I've never said Iran won the war, but the US and Israel lost the war on day one when they hit that school, because they lost the propaganda battle. You didn't have something like that in Iraq until the Abu Ghraib scandal a little while later. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, you didn't have a moment like that, but you had it on the first day. And it was really a tragedy, both for the U.S. image, but of course for the families of these people, but also just it was bound to fail at that within the first few hours of the war.
So as we see, the peace talks not really go anywhere. Just a bit of a merry-go-round circus, in my opinion. What does it actually take to get the Iranians to negotiate, right? At what point will they feel that the negotiations are worth pursuing versus when they think it's all just not? So what's the tipping point there?
Well, I mean, I would just, it sounds really dull and boring and predictable for me to say this, but I would just go back to 2013. It was when the Barack Obama administration agreed to some kind of enrichment on Iranian soil, some sort of enrichment of uranium, and recognized that right, is when the talks really got underway and they started gelling. And then it was just a matter of filling in the blanks of the 180-page document that was ultimately produced in 2015, a year and a half later. And I think something similar to that would have to take place with regard to, the U.S. administration and Iran. That's basically it. You recognize Iran's right to enrich, and then we can talk. You don't, you start making maximalist demands. You have to give up all this. You have to do this. You have to do that. And then we can start talking. You're not going to get anywhere with Iran. They'd rather go to, I know these people. Look, U.S. has a warrior caste, and they're like the Marines. And I grew up in the Midwest of the United States, and I know that crowd. But, Iran has that caste of people as well, and they are the warrior class, and they are war people. They're into battle, and they're into fighting. There's a demographic description to that. They tend to be more Azeri than Persian. They tend to be, and this is why I always thought the sort of delusion that you're going to get the Azeris to rise up. Why would they rise up? They own the place, they're the ones who run the country pretty much, the Azeris. And they are the overclass, and they always have been. And they are also the military class, and the ranks of the military, ranks of the IRGC tend to be heavy with that crowd. And they're into war, and they're, in charge now. It's like, if you imagine if the U.S. government was hit by a bunch of bombs, and they killed the Speaker of the House, and they killed the President of the United States. They killed the national security head of the National Security Administration, and they destroyed all this stuff, and they bombed all this stuff. And then the U.S. Marines declared that we are in charge of the country now. Everything is cool. Everything is safe. That's basically what has happened in Iran. And I think those people, they live for war, and they have the ethos of war. And now they're kind of in charge, and they don't mind going back to war.
Well, I don't think there's a capacity for either side to really do much more. We can't see the same level of intensity we saw in March. I think that's clear. I'm not saying that they don't have the strategic resilience and endurance to do so, but I don't think
there could be a ground invasion. That's their fantasy. I'm just saying that. That's their fantasy. That's what they want. That's what they hope for. That's what they're prepared for. That's what they've done PowerPoint presentations on. That's what they're been training for all these years and so on. That's where they've set up, ambush sites and perfected the art of roadside bombs and so on and so forth. They're hoping for that war. They live for that.
Now, one of the things that's obviously come out of all of this is external input, external interference, foreign intervention. And Ukraine has really come out as a key player in the Gulf states as supporting them. The Iranians have been a key supplier to Russia over the war in Ukraine. But now Ukraine is returning it seemingly to Saudi Arabia and other Gulf members. So what's your opinion on that?
Well, actually, just coincidentally, last week, I had a long meeting with a couple of Ukrainians at a think tank in Paris, and we were discussing this very topic in detail. And I've spent a lot of time in the Gulf, and my understanding is that they really don't want to. They would love the Ukrainian help, but they're not going to. But what the Ukrainians need is material support for their war. And I'm assuming, based on what I know and people I've spoken to, that the Saudis and the Emiratis are going to be really reluctant to upset the Russians because of the long history they have with Russia and Ukraine's very shallow ties to the region and its very unseasoned and inexperienced diplomatic corps. Ukraine is a relatively young country. It doesn't have the networks that Russia has in these countries. You got to consider that, the Soviet Union was incredible at both diplomacy and spycraft, and they built extensive networks in these countries that continue to operate to some extent. And those include, for example, money laundering networks, the ties between Chechen oligarchs and the Saudi officials and business partnerships they have together. You have the money laundering and the oligarchs basically buying up parts of Dubai and partnering with people inside the United Arab Emirates. So there's really deep connections between these Gulf states and Russia. And you can see that in their reluctance to criticize Russia. When Russia invaded Ukraine, the whole world, at least in the West, was in an uproar about this. And the Gulf states were like, yeah, we've seen that before. Not, whatever. You didn't do anything one of the things I heard, and it's not necessarily, it's a little bit disingenuous, but they were saying that, you didn't care about Palestine. Why should we care about Ukraine? But in addition to that, there was a real, apathy about what's happening in Ukraine among the Gulfies. And I think that it's going to be a hard sell for the Ukrainians. And the Ukrainians that I was speaking to were acknowledging that. They were saying that they were having real, like the Emiratis, the Saudis, less the Qataris. The Qataris were more open to talking, were open to taking any technological innovations that Ukraine had to offer with regard to combating the swarms of Shahed drones and so on. But they were less reluctant to engage in, for example, credit swaps and currency partnerships to help bolster the Ukrainian economy, or even, participate in some ways in investment in Ukraine, which is probably not a bad time to invest. If you think about this country, it's probably a good buying time to bring some capital and to provide some material support for the war effort. Far different attitude towards that than towards taking any advice or technical expertise.
So you don't think that Ukraine has any leverage at all? Because they've been deepening their relationship. I read an article just earlier today about how they've been upscaling the cooperation with the US, especially. They've demonstrated
US.
in interceptors and anti-drone capabilities, which is exactly what the Emiratis especially need. The Saudis not as much so, the Qataris to an extent. So, is the Russia-Saudi relationship, as an example, that deeply embedded? Because they've had some pretty difficult dynamics in OPEC Plus.
I do. I think they are. There is a real unwillingness so far on the part of the Gulf countries to alienate Russia. There has been, and it's been pretty obvious.
Between different types of Gulf countries, because when we use that term, there's 5 or 6. So isn't there?
Sure.
Doesn't it depend? Like the Gulf countries are all split now. The Emiratis have left OPEC, and the Saudi Emirati relationship is terrible.
Yeah, but still, they all have and that makes, in a way, their separation from each other makes them more unwilling to damage relations with any of the superpowers, be that the United States, be that Russia, be that China. So I think that is a dynamic that is in play. According to the people that I talked to, there was nothing but frustration from the Ukrainians in their Gulf endeavors. Like I said, the Gulf countries are more than willing to take the expertise that the Ukrainians have, but it was in terms of actual cooperation, they're unwilling to do much that would alienate Russia. And I think that also goes, by the way, for Israel. I think it's a similar dynamic there. Israel doesn't want to piss off Russia as much as it maybe identifies with Ukraine a little bit. I'm not sure. Maybe it does. Basically, in
is under pressure and has been under pressure, has been under overt U.S. pressure to help out in the Ukraine war effort over the years. And yet it is reluctant to do so because of the special relationship it continues to have with Russia.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah, I mean, that goes against what I've been hearing. So you're pretty firm on that then.
No, but I mean, have you seen? Let me ask you though. Have you seen any reciprocity? Have you seen Israel or the UAE or Saudi Arabia or even Qatar helping out Ukraine? I mean, I think Qatar has offered its diplomatic support and willing to kind of act as an interlocutor and so on, and offer its good graces for any kind of negotiations and so on. But there has been, despite the massive sovereign wealth funds that these countries have, despite the considerable military tools that they have access to, and that goes for Israel too, there's been very little traffic towards Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, the war's only been going on for 2 months, so it's not enough time to develop such systems and dynamics in place yet. But I am aware that the Ukrainians are working quite hard on that. I mean, at the end of the day, it's self-interested. They need to keep themselves in the news and relevant to the broader dynamics of Russia and America and the sort of mega trends. Certainly, the war in Ukraine is not going well for the Russians. Even more Victory Day parades on Saturday, I think, demonstrated that quite clearly. I think it's.
I mean, you said the war has been going on for a few months, but Ukraine's war has been going on for 4 years, and I think that if the Emiratis and the Saudis and the Israelis have not been moved to help in that 4 years, as they've watched this war unfold, as they've watched schools and families being killed, as they've watched hospitals being hit by double tap strikes and so on by the Russians in Ukraine, if they've not been moved to help, it's going to take a lot more than some, advice on how to shoot down Shaheeds that's going to get them to act at this point. That's my informed speculation.
Yeah, I mean, I remember an article from Politico back in late April, so two and a half weeks ago, that the Ukrainians had secured a couple of oil lifelines from the Gulf states, like they had reached pacts with Saudi, Qatar, and that was in exchange for military support. So that the Ukrainians have been developing some kind of mutual defense arrangement. Whether or not that's actually been followed through with actual action yet remains to be seen. But I think that change is coming like that, and I think the Ukrainians are, what's the word, exercising their diplomatic hand quite well, considering how influential they are, which isn't as much.
Yeah, and considering how inexperienced they are, like I said, it's a relatively young country, and it doesn't have access to the deep diplomatic core that Russia has had over the decades, just because it was kind of launched early. And these think tank people I was speaking to were also kind of noting that we don't have the experience, we don't have the language skills as our Russian rivals, we don't have the deep ties, we don't have the community and business relations that the Russians have. So we're at a slight disadvantage. But as you pointed out, and this is why they asked to meet with me, they were really eager to try to pursue these channels.
Yeah, I'm just reading it here. So he said that they had arranged 10-year agreements with 3 countries, adding in return for its combat expertise. So Kiev would receive missile interceptors, financial assistance, and supplies of oil and diesel. And in exchange, they would provide in-depth training on things like interceptor drones and other methods. So it does seem like there's movement here.
This is modest improvements. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like the Russians are so caught up in the war in Ukraine that they've kind of neglected the Middle East to a large extent, right? Look at the situation with Syria.
Well, yeah, sure, they lost Syria. Yeah.
So do you not think that the balance of power there is shifting?
I mean, I would hope so for the sake of the Ukrainians, and that I think there is, how should we say, there is a possibility there. But, it's going to be tough. And, those agreements, that agreement that you just referred to, I saw something about that. That's from like a couple weeks ago, if I recall, from the time that Zelensky visited. Is that correct?
Yeah, I said it was in late April. This was coming from Politico on April 26th.
Yeah, I mean, I recall that, but I really look very skeptically at those kinds of deals, those long-term deals when they are announced in the Gulf, especially. I've been trained over the years to look at these press releases for what they are, which is often like flimsy memorandums of understanding that could turn into something down the line, but very often don't bear fruit.
Mm. So
Perhaps
where
in
do
this
you see
case,
this
it'll be
going
different.
then? Well, in the context of the war in Iran and the
Well,
relationship to the war in Ukraine, what do you think happens if the war in Iran does peter out? Does that benefit the situation in the war in Ukraine for Russia or Ukraine? Or if it heats up again, take me through either scenario.
That's an interesting question. I think that if it peters out, it will benefit everybody. I mean, I think it'll benefit the world economy, and that is a net benefit, I think, for Ukraine versus Russia. The very high oil prices that we're experiencing now because of this crisis is really helping Russia in the long run. Even though, as you've noted, there have been these fairly significant tactical gains by Ukraine in recent weeks and even months, but they're still, you got to admit, they're still marginal, those gains that they've made, the progress that the Ukrainians have made. Although marginal, they do point to like more broad capabilities on the part of the Ukrainians that could be promising down the line. But I think if the war continues, it makes it really hard. Not only does the Middle East war not only would a Middle East war suck up valuable supplies of interceptors and defense technologies, it would suck up diplomatic bandwidth as well as U.S. attention that would probably detract from Ukraine and the Ukraine effort. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I mean, of course, it's all interlinked, and the global ramifications of the war in Iran, considering how short it's been going on relative to the war in Ukraine, is insane. Yeah, I think it shows the interconnection of everything now. Nothing happens in isolation, and certainly not conflicts of this magnitude and frequency in the modern world. But Borzou, I mean, I guess the last question is really, what would you encourage people to look out for? What would you encourage people to focus on in the next period? Maybe we can have you back, in the short to medium term.
Well, I mean, I think it's going to be interesting what happens, because a lot of what Trump's and the U.S.'s focus has been over the last few weeks was this big meeting that's going to take place this week in China. And, that was one of the reasons why first of all, he delayed the meeting for a month because of the crisis in the Middle East. If listeners recall, they were supposed to meet in April, and they delayed it because of what was happening with this war. And Trump has been trying to kind of desperately bring some kind of resolution to the conflict, either a military victory or a perceived military victory or some kind of deal that he could call a victory ahead of this meeting. Now, he didn't get that, and he's going to Beijing. If he's going there, I think on the 13th and the 14th, maybe tomorrow and the next day, and he will not have that. And then after that, I think it'll be interesting to see if there's still that time pressure. If now that hard deadline is over, it'll be a blockade of attrition, if not a war of attrition, between the two sides. And perhaps he won't feel the pressure to make a quick deal, and he'll maybe act a little bit more like the Iranians in terms of playing out the clock and waiting for the other guy to sweat.
Okay, well, on that sweaty point, Borzou, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on. Thank you very much for joining us. Everyone for watching, do check out Borzou's work and his written commentary, which I think is pretty dynamic, and you've got I can see your character coming through in the way you write as well. So do check that out. But and also, of course,
yeah, you can. If I may say, please visit my Substack. It's at Borzou, BORZOU.substack.com. Consider subscribing. Lots of free content as well as some paid content.
Yeah, and well, on that subscription point, subscribe here. Of course, if you're watching this, you've got to subscribe to me, subscribe to Borzou's. This video will go out on Substack as well, so I'm sure you can restack it, Borzou, and then some people can come over to the YouTube as well and enjoy all your content, talking as well.
I'm going to hit like, and I'm going to subscribe on YouTube right now.
Oh, there you go. Follow this man's lead, everybody. He has the right idea. But on that, we'll see you all very next time. Take care out there.
Bye-bye.
Hey, thanks a lot for listening in. Again, I'm Borzou Deragahi. This is my podcast. You can subscribe by visiting my Substack. It's at borzou.substack.com. Please listen in on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube as well. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.